The federal government, as you know, is solely responsible for cross-border infrastructure, including pipelines. That's been litigated before.
To do some of the things Alberta wants to do, it needs to work with British Columbia.
And here we go. A week ago, we broke down why a pipeline quote-unquote deal built on a non-binding memo could run into serious political roadblocks. After yesterday's announcement, those roadblocks are already showing themselves. With a cabinet resignation, BC raising objections, and disagreement over the meaning of the MOU already beginning, things are about to get interesting as Carney juggles internal party unrest and rising tension with the provinces. Let's take a look.
Hi, Bashi.
I was listening to your press conference very closely just a few moments ago, and my impression was you were speaking as though it's kind of a done deal with this pipeline. And I just wanted to be clear for our viewers. If there is no private proponent, this pipeline doesn't get built, correct? Still?
That's what it says in the MOU. We're looking to have a private proponent build it. And that's, I think, the whole purpose of this exercise with the Major Projects Office, is that we want to ensure that we've got a regulatory process that is not only predictable, but will also result in a positive outcome. And once we get to that point, I have no doubt that a private proponent, either a single one or a consortium, will step forward to build it. And that's what we're working towards.
So that's actually a really astute political answer, as we've come to expect from Danielle Smith. What is she kind of saying there? Well, the issue with any private investment in Canada at all, which is why there hasn't really been one in any of these projects, is that because there's so much bureaucracy, they don't want to spend the vast amounts of money investing into proposals, trying to get clearance, trying to get approvals, and then it's just sitting on the shelf for years and ultimately being denied. So what Danielle Smith is saying there is, listen, it is not going to be palatable for any Canadian to have to foot the bill for a pipeline. So what we want to do is we want private corporations to come in. They put up the capital, but they're only going to do that if they know that they're going to be able to navigate all of the bureaucracy to get it in, right? There's not going to be issues getting permits. There's not going to be issues getting the environmental approval. There's not going to be issues getting any of that stuff. So you want to make this as easy as possible to do business with any private corporations when it comes to putting a pipeline in. And that's exactly what she's saying there. We want it to be predictable. We want these corporations to know that there's an easy pathway to get this done. And the only obstacle from their perspective is going to be raising the capital.
There is also language in the MOU, though, around a backstop, about the potential backstop, I should say, at both the federal and the provincial level when it comes to Indigenous co-ownership. What does that mean? Is that in the form of loans? Or, to be clear, again, for Albertans and Canadians watching, like, is there any taxpayer money going into this thing?
Well, I can tell you the approach that we've taken, which I'm pleased to see that other provinces and the federal government have replicated, is offering loan guarantees. One of the insights that my predecessor, Jason Kenney, had was that one of the reasons why bands are not able to take on ownership stakes is because they need a bank to ensure that they will underwrite the loan. And that's what we step in with. We do it through our Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation. We have the ability to underwrite up to $3 billion in loan guarantees. We're about $750 million right now on a variety of projects. And that's what we would put towards this, is the offer of a loan guarantee. I think the British Columbia government has something similar. The federal government does as well. But that has proven successful, especially on these kinds of projects that have a long-term revenue stream associated with tolling once they're up and running.
So what is this? So what I interpret this is to be, if it's an incentive for the Indigenous communities to actually, A, be a proponent for these projects, but also B, to potentially be part owners of it. And what this is it seems like the federal government, or the Alberta government, is saying, listen, in order to actually become part owners in this, many of these Indigenous communities cannot raise the capital for it and cannot actually get any sort of loan from the bank. So what they can do is they can actually get a loan from the Alberta government in order to actually get in on the ownership of these projects. and the Alberta government will actually guarantee that loan. So it allows them some incentive to actually be for these potentially major money-making projects, and it also allows them to, as part of that part ownership group, they can bring more money into their community as a result of that as well. So it's a very clever approach here from Alberta.
I have to ask, look, I've conducted a number of interviews with the Premier of British Columbia on this subject. The one thing that confounds me is why he wasn't brought into the discussions earlier. Did you and the Prime Minister put the prospect of this project at risk by not bringing him and Coastal First Nations into the fold earlier? And if so, why?
Well, I know I've done many, many conversations with you where I think every press conference, every time I was asked about this, I said that we were in conversations with the federal government over this, that we were going back and forth, that we had multiple different drafts, that we had a negotiating team. I've been talking about that for months. So the reason why we had to is most of the elements of this deal are related to Alberta. Removing the emissions cap was vitally important for us to get all projects going ahead. Getting the carve out on the clean electricity regs, that applies to Alberta because 90% of our power grid is natural gas, and various other elements. The greenwashing bill to be able to get that also repealed. So there were a number of things that we had to do here to restore confidence in developing the production side of the business, but also restore confidence in being able to deploy new electricity infrastructure as well. So most of the MOU deals with creating an investment climate for Alberta. And then the federal government, as you know, is solely responsible for cross-border infrastructure, including pipelines. That's been litigated before. And I'm glad to see that the Prime Minister has an intention to work with us on that.
And here we go, folks. Okay. So notice Vashi starts at this question by saying, well, what about Premier Eby? What about the Coastal First Nations in BC? Why weren't they included in these conversations? Danielle Smith doesn't really address that. She says, well, listen, everything that almost everything that's in this MOU is related to Alberta, with the emissions caps, with tanker bans, and production and all of this stuff. So we've been dealing with the federal government, and our team has been dealing with the federal government. She completely sidesteps this, whether or not EB should be brought in. And she's saying, listen, we've done our part, and it's up to the federal government because they're the one who has jurisdiction. It's up to them to talk to BC. It's up to them to talk to the First Nations out west. That's not in our bailiwick. That's a federal government thing, because we don't have the power to grant or not grant any type of permits, and we don't have any jurisdiction over the province of British Columbia. The federal government does, so they need to actually engage on that.
And I take your point about a large part of this applying to your province, but there's another big part, if this pipeline does go ahead, that clearly applies to British Columbia, including the potential removal or exemption. I know the language is very specific in the document around the tanker ban. The point that Premier Eby has made is that even speculation around that has put very real, as he characterizes it, projects around LNG at risk, because Coastal First Nations have supported those projects because there is a tanker ban. I have heard you on multiple occasions talk about the imposition of laws that you consider bad and put investments in your province at risk. Why would you participate in a process that does the same for another premier? Can you understand how he feels?
Well, I believe in the Constitution, and so I know things that are intra-provincial projects are the responsibility of the province, but ports are federal jurisdiction. Cross-border pipelines and transmission lines are federal jurisdiction, and trade and commerce is federal jurisdiction. You cannot have a province blocking access of another landlocked province to get their products to market. That's been determined by the courts. And so we're very pleased to already start the consultation and with the nations, including Coastal First Nations. I had a very pleasant conversation with the Haisla chief yesterday, and they made it very clear that they're open to all kinds of work with Alberta on all kinds of products, maybe not as enthusiastic about bitumen, but they're also excited about expanding LNG and also expanding additional export opportunities. So I would say I have not experienced what Premier Eby has described. I haven't heard a single nation that we've engaged with in British Columbia say that they're going to trade off one against the other. They're letting us know what their perspectives are. We're pleased for that. And we're going to keep on working with them to see if we can put together a consortium that will also be able to own a portion of this new line.
And this is where Danielle Smith does this really, really well. So she is not dumb. as we all know. She's a very, very smart politician. And what she's done here is she's tried to put a fence around Mark Carney, so he can't get out. And what she's arguing here, despite the fact that you can look at some of her previous statements in the past and say, well, you argued, against the federal government's constitutional authority before, but now you're saying that you believe in the Constitution because now it works in your favor. That's a different discussion for a different day. But what she's doing here is saying, listen, if Alberta is subject to the federal Constitution, so is British Columbia, so is Quebec, so is Ontario, so is every other province and territory. So she's saying, when it comes to projects and inter-provincial projects, that's in the jurisdiction of the provinces. That's me. That's where my authority ends. When you start talking about going over the provincial border, now that's the federal government. The federal government has to step in and do this. So she's very cleverly put a fence around Mark Carney, and we'll come back to that. This is what Tim Hodgson, Minister of Energy, had to say after the announcement with Vassy Kapelos and after Vassy's conversation with Danielle Smith.
Why wasn't more of the hard work done on the partnership front when it comes to BC in particular in advance of today's signing? Premier Eby, has staked out a very clear position. He said he learned, for example, last week of the prospect of what could be in this MOU from reading about it in the paper. Why didn't your government do more to bring him and his government into the fold in order to ensure that the prospect for whatever you do want to see go ahead from an economic perspective actually happens? Was that a mistake?
So this government works with all of the provinces and territories. Our Prime Minister regularly talks with all of the premiers. I talk with all of my counterparts. I know our Minister of Environment does the same with her counterparts. I will be going to British Columbia tonight to meet with my counterparts and meet with the Premier tomorrow. What I can tell you is this agreement is very clear. We need to work together with British Columbia. It's part of the agreement. It calls for a trilateral table to advance things. And it is very clear that to do some of the things Alberta wants to do, it needs to work with British Columbia. That's something that Danielle Smith has said she wants to do, and she's committed to doing.
All right. So now you have Tim Hodgson, Mark Carney's energy minister, saying, listen, if Alberta wants to do what they want to do, they have to talk to British Columbia. Not us. They have to.
She also said very specifically today that the MOU contains nothing that would afford BC even an effective veto. I know there's not a constitutional one, but even something that amounts to an effective veto. Do you agree with that position?
What it says is we will work together to do something that is in the benefit of both provinces. We are committed to doing that hard work. We're committed to sitting down with them. I'm not going to prejudge outcomes. I believe this is a country where all Canadians want their politicians, want their premiers to work together and try and get to a better place for Canada. We are in a hinge moment. We are in a time of economic rupture. Canadians expect their leaders to sit down and work together and work out these hard problems. And that's what we're committed to doing with every premier of every province and territory.
I'm not asking, though, based on a hypothetical. Premier Eby, on multiple instances, has been unequivocal about his position. This pipeline is a no-go. So I'm asking you if you agree with the Premier's assessment that ultimately that decision will be the federal government's and that there is no effective veto for BC.
So it is a hypothetical because there is no pipeline today. We don't have a route. The Premier Smith,
but you just wrote an entire MOU then on a potential pipeline.
Premier Smith has been very clear. She does not yet have a route. She has said that they are doing their work and they expect to come back to the federal government by next summer with a proposed route. Clearly, between now and then, if they're acting as a proponent, they will need to work with British Columbia if it is a pipeline through British Columbia, and they will need to work with affected First Nations. That is part of the MOU. That is what Premier Smith has said she's prepared to do as a proponent. We applaud that, and we will be constructive in any discussions between Alberta, British Columbia, and affected First Nations.
There you go. So Danielle Smith is saying, listen, nothing to do with us. Federal government has to do this. Federal government is saying, nothing to do with us. Alberta has to do this if they want it. Who's going to win this? Well, it will be interesting, because if you strip everything away and just look at the facts, the federal government is the one who has jurisdiction. Alberta can't do anything. Alberta can ask Premier Eby to play nice on this, but it's not required that they do so. Because the federal government could come in and say, listen, remember, Carney made his whole campaign about, I am bringing in nation building projects. We need to build Canada strong. And now what he's saying is, I was campaigning on all those things, but I'm actually not going to be the one to show leadership to actually do that. If Premier Smith and Alberta, they want a pipeline, they have to do all the work. I'm going to be showing no leadership on that whatsoever. The only quote-unquote leadership I'm going to do is essentially give them a conditional memo that says, if you do all this stuff, and if you get everybody to play nice together, sure, you can have a pipeline. Almost like an adult talking to a child. And this was very similar to what we said back on the 19th of November. Remember this? This is Mr. Carney playing politics. So this is Mark Carney saying, yeah, no problem, Danielle. Yeah, let's put together a memorandum of understanding. Yeah, we'll do that. And then what happens? Then David Eby says, no, we're not going to have a pipeline at all. And then Mark Carney can say, oh, well, that's unfortunate, Danielle. It's unfortunate, Canada. See, we were all for this, but, we need provincial buy-in, so I guess it's not my fault. I guess you have to blame David Eby and not me. Well, here's the thing. Yes, we can absolutely blame Mark Carney. And why is that? Because he doesn't actually require the permission from David Eby, because this is a federal project and they can kind of trump the provinces when it comes to this stuff if they designate it a federal project. So this is exactly what's happening. The only thing that we missed on in that particular video is the fact that Danielle Smith was getting ahead of the messaging of Mark Carney, getting ahead of the messaging of the federal government. What do we always say? Be first to control that narrative and make sure that everybody knows, listen, this is the federal government's jurisdiction. We can do nothing on this. If they really want a pipeline, if they're serious about a pipeline, then they need to say to the province of British Columbia, get out of the way. And what did we see from Pierre Poilievre and the opposition this week? They were saying the exact same thing, that Carney was hiding behind David Eby and this pipeline would never get built. So we'll see, because pressure is mounting. And now we see that Stephen Guilbeault has resigned in cabinet. So obviously he's really ticked about this, which also means that the other environmentalists in the Liberal caucus, they're ticked about this because they think this is sending a bad message. And they think there's even a possibility of this pipeline even getting built. So Mark Carney has really put himself into a pickle. He thinks he's being clever, and we will see how clever that he actually is. But he thinks he's being clever by saying, sure, I'll give you a pipeline, knowing that David Eby will be completely opposed to this. He's gambling that the First Nations will be completely opposed to this, and he's gambling that there won't be enough pressure from everybody else to actually pull the constitutional lever and say, yes, it's my jurisdiction, and yes, this pipeline is going to get built in British Columbia, whether the Premier wants it or not, because this is a federal project. And then he's going to be gambling that all of his internal caucus that are the staunch environmentalists aren't going to be ticked off enough as well. So it's going to be very interesting to see how the media actually covers this. Are we going to hear 6 weeks of Mark Carney's leadership is in trouble because he has internal dissension from the cabinet? We have people resigning. Chrystia Freeland wants to go off to Poland. There was rumors of Melanie Jolie going off to Paris. She's tried to deny those. And Stephen Guilbeault, he's resigned from cabinet. What's going on? Are we going to get 6 weeks of this? Or are we going to get this as a speed bump and move on to the next conservative leadership issue? I guess we'll see, folks. But this is how this pipeline is breaking down. It is pure politics. And Danielle Smith has played this very, very well. We will see how the federal government and Mark Carney tries to catch up.